Hi, I'm Prashant Gopal with I cover housing for Bloomberg, and we have a fantastic panel today and not all that much time, so I want to quickly introduce them before jumping into questions. So we have Chris Herbert, who is Managing Director of the Center for the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard. Alanna McCargo, she's Vice President of the Housing Finance Policy Center at the Urban Institute. And Germaine Smith-Baugh, she's President and CEO of the Urban League of Broward County in South Florida. So let me start by saying that racial and economic disparities in housing existed long before COVID, but the virus may be making them worse. Prices, I think a lot of people expected them to crash, but home prices are surging in much of the country thanks to below 3% mortgage rates. But unemployment is high, and it's hitting service workers and lower paid workers hardest. Many of them are renters, and they're disproportionately Black and Hispanic. So I wanted to start with a question poll question we put out on Twitter. The question was, what is the best way to boost Black and Hispanic homeownership? And it seems like almost half of people responded said that the best way would be to increase job opportunities, followed by improving financial literacy. So I want to put that same question to all of you. What do you think the best approach is? And we'll start with Alanna.
Thanks so much, Prashant. So I think that the answer you got on jobs directly correlates to, the issue of income, which is so important in the homeownership context. And what we're seeing right now in the COVID-19 context, and why we're seeing such stress on homeownership and renter ability to pay is because of the disproportionate unemployment that we've seen, particularly for Black and Brown families nationwide, and the impact that that's having on ability to make housing payments. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, certainly to improve income inequality. We have a long way to go there, and that will have a certain effect on homeownership. But it's not even just an income question. I think to your point of education and some of the other issues, as well as access to credit, those are all really critical components of being able to make meaningful differences in the homeownership rate.
So Germaine?
I absolutely agree with my colleague here, because it's not just an issue of income, it's income at wages that will actually allow people to be able to move forward in being able to purchase the home. And I also do agree that on the second point where they talk about financial literacy is an important aspect, because we know in many minority communities and minority families, the issue of understanding the finances and how to move through the process of homeownership is not something that is necessarily taught, or is it passed down from generation to generation? So I think it's a combination of both, and I'm sure we're going to get into some more dialogue on that.
Chris, I'm sorry. Chris.
Oh yeah, so I'll just, given what I would agree with what they say, so I'll just add, which is one of the choices had to do with down payment assistance, low down payment mortgages. I would say we need to have more financial assistance up front to meet the down payment requirement, to meet the closing cost requirement, to make sure there's a cushion in there, and that provides greater access to credit as well. I think really important issue here is the historical legacy of discrimination in housing markets, which contributes to the fact that African Americans today have 30 percentage point lower home ownership rate than whites, and Hispanics 26 points. Alanna will correct me, but big gaps. And what that means is your parents don't own homes, and one of the primary ways in which first-time buyers get into home ownership is help from family and friends. And since we didn't help, we put up barriers for the last generation, the last multiple generations getting into home ownership, there's an obligation to help close that gap through down payment assistance and upfront cash to provide that assistance that your family can't, because they were precluded from owning homes.
So there's a question from the audience here about universal basic income. Would a policy like that move the needle in the right direction? I don't know if anyone wants to take that.
Sure, I'll take a stab at it just because it's such an important question. One of the things we're kind of we have a national experiment going on right now with this concept. If you think about the start of the COVID crisis, the stimulus checks that went out early on, and then the continued the supplemental unemployment insurance, the extra $600 a week that people that were unemployed were getting in their pockets to be able to help them get through that initial unemployment. That was a test of sorts of a national sort of basic income, putting cash in people's hands to be able to help them get through the early part of this crisis. Most of all of those benefits have expired, and people are still unemployed and needing additional supplements. So I think there's a lot of conversation we still need to have about how you could potentially put stimulus or income in the pockets of households so that they can pay their bills, pay their rent, so that their landlords can get paid and everybody can continue to move forward and stay in place during something like a pandemic. So I think we have a natural experiment going on. I think there are obviously experiments of UBI going on all over the country, like in Stockton, California. And I do think the early signs are promising. Putting cash in people's hands is actually a way to help them get through, especially in times of crisis.
I would just add to that, in terms of thinking about home ownership, I'm not sure a universal basic income is going to be a solution to the kind of jobs that we were talking about. We're talking about good paying jobs that allow you to support a mortgage on a house. I do think universal basic income would speak a lot to the issue we're seeing now of how do we keep people stably housed, particularly renters who have lower incomes. And so that stability of income would be an enormously beneficial housing policy so that when things happen, people have the ability to keep making their rent payment, which is, Alanna was saying, that federal support was instrumental this year in keeping people housed through the first part of the pandemic.
I will just add that there's new evidence out that was incredibly helpful for homeowners that were trying to keep their house. So I agree with you completely on that point, and think that it's just something that we need to experiment with. That those supplements actually really helped.
And I would agree with my colleagues here that on the ground, we absolutely saw that when those resources were received, that the individuals brought those resources to their landlords in order to be able to come current on rent and other occupancy issues. So definitely agree.
So just one thing here on home ownership, I guess this is for Alanna, but we see this massive gap between white home ownership and Black and Hispanic home ownership. And last decade's crash was devastating to people of color. You saw those rates just plummet. And that was a foreclosure crisis that started with mortgages. This is a little different. We have, I'm just wondering what you think, how this might play out this time, whether we might see rates fall from here, or could it go the other direction?
Well, I do think we're in a moment that is really putting a lot of pressure to widen the gap, the racial disparities that you were talking about. Before we even got to the COVID-19 crisis, there was, as Chris mentioned earlier, a 30-point gap between white and Black homeowners, 26 points between Black and Hispanic homeowners. So these gaps have been there. These are not new. This crisis is very different in terms of how it's putting pressure, particularly on the homeownership side. I'll let Chris speak to the rental side. But we didn't have a massive drop in home prices. As you mentioned, Prashant, home prices have been stable, and in some markets they're going up because really we have a real lack of affordable supply, and there's not that many homes available for people to purchase at an affordable level. So that's one issue. And we're not seeing that kind of home price pressure this time. We also saw the government quickly put in action forbearance, which really has forestalled any immediate action in terms of delinquencies. So up to 12-month forbearance program under the CARES Act was put in place. Many millions of homeowners, up to 4 million at one point, were taking advantage of that forbearance. So they were able to miss their payments. And we're right now, it's mid-October, we're facing a point where now a lot of those people that have been in forbearance for 6 months are coming out. And this is going to be a time where they have to make contact with their mortgage servicers, and they need to tell them if they need to extend further or they need to get into a permanent solution to recoup and repay that last 6 months of payments that have not been made. So it's really important that I just want to make this point, that people know that there are forbearance options out there. It doesn't cover everyone, but you should really be in touch with your mortgage servicer to understand, or a housing counselor to understand what your options might be. And this time, I mean, the data has shown us through this period of the last 8 months that Black and Latino households are really having difficulty making their mortgage and rent payments at a much higher level than other families. And we understand that correlates directly to the fact that the unemployment rate for Black and Latino families is much higher than it is nationally. So I think it's important that we look at all of these trends. And this is sort of where we're going to see if we can't keep people in their homes through these forbearance and alternative options, a lot of, a wave to come of potential distress, delinquency, default, and foreclosure.
So I want to pivot a little bit to the rental market, which actually does seem like it in some ways is the bigger concern right now. A lot of those renters are in vulnerable jobs, and a lot of people were expecting a huge wave of evictions, and we haven't really seen it yet. And so my question to Chris here is whether are we out of the woods, or maybe are there problems ahead?
We are by no means out of the woods. I think it's important to remember, as we came into the pandemic, we were already arguably in a rental housing crisis. We had 21 million renters spending more than 30% of their income on housing, which is the typical benchmark for what's not affordable. But more importantly, we had 11 million who were spending more than 50%. So that's where we started. And then, as Alanna was saying, renters have lost income more than homeowners have, but Blacks and Hispanics have lost their income even more so. And so we have a situation where having already been financially stressed, devoting so much of your income to housing, and now your income is shrunk, there's certainly just a tremendous amount of financial distress among renters. As you said, we haven't seen a wave of foreclosures yet for two important reasons. First of all, we've had a number of eviction moratoria that have been imposed by states across the country. Many states put limits on ability to evict people during the pandemic, many of which are now starting to expire, which led the CDC to impose its own eviction moratoria, which is more restrictive, but it still is there as a protection for renters. And the eviction lab at Princeton under Matt Desmond has been documenting trends in evictions. And you can see the impact of these moratoria, where evictions basically fell to near zero for a long period of time. And as these moratoria are lifted, evictions are going up. Now, they haven't gone up as sharply as we fear they may yet, in part because of the federal supports that we've seen, particularly the unemployment insurance and the extra benefits provided to workers to compensate for that lost income. Very interesting piece today in the New York Times by Emily Badger and her colleagues, looking at data from checking accounts and seeing how, in fact, that extra $600 a week was actually being saved by a lot of renters who lost their jobs. Yeah. And that has provided a cushion that's gone into the fall so far. So we expected after the end of July 31st, when these benefits went away, that there would be an immediate price to pay. It hasn't happened yet, in part because people were marshaling their resources and protecting themselves. But that money is running out, as the New York Times analysis shows. Rent is still due. People are still unemployed. And so I think that we are now at a position as we go into the winter, particularly when COVID may come back for another surge, where I think the rental problems are really in front of us, and they are significant.
So like sort of playing off of what Chris just said, Germaine, you're on the ground. The Trump administration and Florida and other states have put in these eviction bans to prevent homelessness during a global pandemic. But how's it working in practice? Are landlords trying to find ways around it? And I don't know if you have any specific examples of things that you guys have seen.
Yeah. I would say, one of the things that's really unique about urban leagues and our urban league here in Fort Lauderdale, as well as urban leagues around the United States, is not only do we provide direct services in the area of rental counseling, rental assistance, home ownership counseling, but many of us are also affordable housing landlords. So we actually have the experience, really on both sides of understanding the issues. And I would tell you that your video probably depicts better than any words that I could give. The video that started off the segment, because that is the reality of so many individuals. So yes, the moratoriums that were put in place, the idea that the rents will be delayed is still, for a renter, you are still terrified because the bill isn't going away. The bill is still going to be there. So at the end of the day, if your income doesn't begin to come in, you're either going to have a situation where you're leaving the place that you're in and having unpaid rent, which then leaves an eviction on your credit report. And we all know on this call, and your audience too, how that creates, a ripple effect for where you go next. So I think that we have to really understand, even in South Florida, in a recent article from Sun Sentinel, there are over 5,000, and I know that number has definitely gone north, of evictions, in the system, just waiting to move forward. So I think we have to be really, really understanding and of the feelings that our renters are having. The last point I'll make in terms of your question about the landlords, renters are afraid to talk to landlords, and not all, but landlords are definitely creating uncomfortable spaces for their renters because they too want to get, their resources and move forward. But what we have found is that in terms of when rent was affordable, so affordable rental from the beginning, coupled with a value proposition of that landlord knowing and understanding and communicating that value, that renters are coming to the table with their resources because they don't want to go anywhere else.
So I'm going to build off a question that someone in the audience asked a little while back. How do you create more affordable housing in this environment? We're seeing sort of a shift, especially it's pretty dramatic in New York, but also San Francisco, but in other places too, where there's a shift away from cities and into suburbs, but it's leaving a lot of the fact that people can work remotely. There's a potential that could leave a bunch of office space vacant. Is there a potential way, for example, to convert that into housing? Are there new ways that we need to think about how to provide more affordable housing? Whoever wants to take it.
I guess I'll start. I mean, obviously we will see how the pandemic changes demand for office space. It's not necessarily easy, I would say, to convert a floor plate that's designed for office space to a floor plate for residential housing. You need to have a lot more access to light. You need to have a lot more plumbing. Need to have a lot more separation of spaces than you do on an office floor plate. So we'll see how well that works and how much the demand for office space falls. But I do think that we are seeing a certain dropping of demand, stresses in the rental sector. There may well be properties that become on the market at prices we haven't seen in a long time. And I do think if we think about an affordability strategy on the part of the public and nonprofit sectors, it would be to position them to be able to acquire housing that's already in the residential rental stock, to preserve it as affordable rental housing going forward, to put it in the hands of owners who have more of a social mission. There is the opportunity to do this after the foreclosure crisis. The NSP Neighborhood Stabilization Program that the federal government put out was intended to do that. It turned out that a lot of these public and nonprofit entities weren't nimble enough to be able to compete with the private sector. Hopefully we've learned some lessons. And I know there's conversations happening in cities across the country now is how do we take advantage of the fact that there's this period where we'll have more affordability that may not last, because remember, we haven't built enough housing and there's still a lot of people looking for housing. So if prices fall now, don't think this is permanent. So I do think we have to capitalize on this, and that means we need to get capital in the hands of the kind of socially motivated investors who can help preserve that affordability.
And
Yeah,
Chris, I would go ahead.
Go ahead.
I would agree with Chris on that. The Urban League of Broward County is a prime example of that. When I reference being an affordable housing landlord, is through the neighborhood stabilization program is one area that we were able to take advantage of that, be nimble enough to be able to provide that resource. So I would say to policymakers or those listening that influence policymakers that the quicker, more expeditiously you can move to shared equity models, concepts. We've learned lessons in the NSP that can definitely be applied in the future, in the current situation. So we do need to be looking at those socially motivated, mission-oriented organizations willing to put their capital on the line to create affordability and neighborhood revitalization and community development.
So, this move away from the cities, right, and toward the suburbs, I guess we don't have all the data in yet to see how much of that is really happening, but it does seem like it's happening in certain places. If that's true, how does that change the dynamics with gentrification in the cities? And could we have suburban gentrification or, even rural gentrification to a certain extent as wealthier people move out?
Elena, I think it's your turn.
Yeah, I certainly think that the jury is out, right, in terms of this kind of mobility you're talking about and people moving around in this pandemic. So I just think there's a lot to still unpack in the data. So I don't have a real specific answer for you that's based in evidence. Some of the, I mean, we understand and know that housing supply, the constraints and everybody's search and quest for something affordable does have some connection to what you might call gentrification or just wealthier people moving into communities that that then ultimately may change the dynamics of those communities. My colleague Lori Goodman did a study on the supply effects of and gentrification, which I encourage everybody to look at. I think that this we gotta sort of need to rethink all of it right now. Housing, your home, whether you're renting it or owning it, is your workplace. It is your schoolyard. It is serving a number of purposes right now that are far different. And I do think that the dynamic, the longer this pandemic goes on, and especially if we see additional spikes and changes in policy and things that happen on the health side, the public health side of this, we're going to see some different behaviors and changes and needs for housing. And moving out to more rural areas or getting more space, and that introduces new issues as related to bandwidth and broadband and access, because you have kids at home and everybody's got to kind of have access to the internet. So there's a whole host of new issues that are emerging in our infrastructure and what we're actually prepared for if there is that kind of movement and migration that you're talking about. But I don't think the data so far is supporting like massive amounts of people like leaving cities and moving yet. But I do think there's a lot we're going to learn over the next year.
So there's a question from the audience. What local solutions are you seeing to address some of these assistance issues? I'm not sure whether that's referring to evictions or something else, but can there be meaningful policy in the absence of political will at a national level to address these issues? So I don't know if someone wants to take that.
So I'll answer real quickly, which is, I think we've seen over the last 10 years, there has been an absence of federal will to take on these issues. And there's been an enormous laboratory of experimentation at the local level to address it. Things that have very much within local control, with regulatory barriers, zoning issues, use of taxation to raise money for affordable housing. So there has been a lot that has happened and localities can do. I will say that this pandemic has put state and local governments in a very strong fiscal bind. And so as much as I do think that there's a we should continue to devolve responsibility for designing programs to the local level where they can put together all the tools in their toolkit and their understanding of the market to be able to devise these solutions. But we need a federal check. The local governments and state governments, particularly now, don't have the resources to address it. So there needs to be a partnership.